Daddy, is she dying? She came in chains, but he gave her a dress, a name, and a second life. The wind howled across the barren stretch of land as the wagon creaked to a halt before the great house that stood like a silent sentinel against the dusk. Its wooden beams were weather-worn, its windows dim with age, yet inside lived a man whose heart was as unyielding as the stone hearth that burned within. His daughter, small and wide-eyed, clutched the folds of her cotton dress as she peered at the figure they had dragged from the wagon. The woman's ankles were raw, her wrists red and torn, bound with heavy iron chains that clinked with every faltering step. She stumbled, her knees hitting the earth, dust rising like a shroud about her frail body. The girl's voice, trembling with the purity of innocence, broke the silence. Daddy, is she dying? The man's jaw tightened, his weathered face unreadable. He had seen much in his life: blood, sorrow, betrayal, but the sight of the woman in chains stirred something deeper, a chord he had long thought silent. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes blazed with both defiance and despair. She was not yet dead, but the weight of the chains seemed to carry death's whisper upon her shoulders. He knelt before her, his rough hands, scarred by years of toil, reaching for the locks that bound her wrists. The sound of iron giving way was sharp, final, like a declaration that echoed into the night. The chains fell, thudding against the earth, and for the first time in what seemed an eternity, the woman's arms trembled free. She did not thank him, nor cry, she only looked up at him with hollow eyes, as though uncertain if freedom was a gift or another cruelty disguised. The little girl stepped closer, her eyes glistening in the fading light. She touched the woman's hand gently, whispering, "She needs a dress, Daddy, not chains." And so the man, who had no reason to show mercy but every reason to, brought her inside. He laid before her a simple garment, woven of coarse linen but soft against her bruised skin. It was white, unstained, a symbol of life where death had lingered too long. When she draped the dress over herself, something shifted in the air. The chains had taken her name, her past, her dignity. But in that moment, as she stood within the walls of the house, clothed not in iron but in grace, he gave her what the world had stolen. He spoke gently, with the firmness of truth. You are no longer what they called you. You will not be their property, nor their shadow. You will have a name. His daughter, with the sweet authority of innocence, whispered the name aloud, and it lingered in the room like the birth of a hymn. The woman pressed the sound of it to her lips, uncertain, as though speaking it might shatter the fragile illusion of her rebirth. Yet when she did, it filled the silence with power. The nights that followed were not easy. The woman's body carried scars that sleep could not heal, and her soul bore wounds deeper still. At times, she awoke screaming, her voice breaking the silence of the house, trembling like a bell struck by unseen hands. The child would rush to her, wrapping small arms around her frame, whispering, "You are safe now. You are not in chains anymore." And slowly, night by night, the screams gave way to silence, the silence to whispers, and the whispers to laughter, fragile at first, but real. The man, though stern and hardened by the world, watched with a quiet awe. He had not sought to be a savior, nor to bear the weight of another's sorrow. Yet in her, he saw something of himself, a life nearly broken, yet still capable of rising from the ashes. The land he worked was harsh, unforgiving, but within his walls a second life was unfolding, one not ridden by cruelty but by mercy. The villagers whispered when they saw her. Some said he had lost his mind, taking in a woman who had been bound in chains. Others mocked, wondering why he wasted bread and shelter on one who bore the mark of servitude. But their whispers did not pierce the walls of his house, nor did they shake the resolve within him. He knew the worth of a soul was not measured by the weight of iron or the judgment of men. As the seasons turned, the woman grew stronger. Her back straightened, her steps steady, and her eyes, once dulled by despair, began to hold a fire that no chain could dim. She tended to the hearth, sang soft songs in the evenings, and in her presence the house itself seemed to breathe differently, as though it, too, had found renewal. The little girl clung to her with the devotion of one who had found not just a companion, but a mother carved from the ruins of suffering. One evening, beneath the glow of a candle, the girl asked once more, her voice innocent yet weighty, "Daddy, is she alive now?" The man's eyes rested on the woman, no longer broken, no longer nameless. He saw her laughter mixing with his daughter's, her hands shaping bread, her steps carrying purpose. He answered softly, with a truth that rang louder than iron against stone. Yes, child, she is alive, and she will live. The woman's eyes met his, and for the first time, she did not look away. In that gaze, there was no longer just gratitude, nor just survival. There was a quiet strength, a silent vow that her second life would not be wasted. She had come in chains, but chains had not claimed her soul. He had given her a dress, a name, and the chance to rise again. And in the stillness of that old house, in the era where mercy was rare and freedom rarer still, a miracle had taken root, not of spectacle, but of rebirth, fierce and unbreakable. The days stretched on into weeks, and the rhythm of the house shifted as if time itself had bent to make room for her presence. The woman, who had once crawled in chains, now walked the wooden floors with bare feet, her steps careful but steady. She moved through the rooms as though learning to breathe again, learning to claim space without fear of punishment. The dress she wore, simple and plain, clung to her like a second skin, and though its fabric was coarse, to her it was finer than silk, for it bore no shackles and carried no shame. The man, stern and broad-shouldered, watched her quietly, not with the eyes of a master but with the weary caution of one who had seen the world's cruelty too often to trust in its sudden tenderness. His hands were calloused from working the land, his heart equally so, yet he found himself softening in ways that unsettled him. He had intended only to remove her chains, to grant her rest from torment, but each passing day bound her more deeply into the life of his household. She tended the fire, fetched water, prepared bread, and in every act there was a gentleness that carried weight, as though she was not merely serving but stitching herself into the fabric of the home. His daughter clung to her with devotion, calling her name, her new name, so often that it rang through the rafters like a song. When she braided the girl's hair, laughter echoed, and when she sang softly in the evenings, the child nestled against her as though she had always belonged. The man would sit by the hearth, silent, pipe in hand, watching the two of them as though seeing visions he had long forgotten, visions of warmth, of family, of something more than survival. Yet beyond the walls, the world was not silent. Whispers grew louder in the village. They said the woman was cursed, that her past would bring ruin, that chains left scars no man could ever cleanse. Some whispered that she was dangerous, others that she was worthless, but all agreed she did not belong. The man heard these words when he walked to the market, their voices dripping with suspicion, their eyes narrowing at him as though mercy itself were a crime. But he did not bend to their words. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. The chains had not stolen her soul, and her life was worth defending. Still, shadows clung to her. Some nights, when the wind wailed against the shutters, she woke in terror, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with memories that clawed their way from the depths of her mind. She would sit upright, clutching at the sheets, her body trembling as though the weight of iron had returned to her limbs. The little girl, woken by the sound, would creep from her bed and curl beside her, whispering again and again, "You are safe. You are here. No chains, no pain." The man, standing in the doorway, would remain silent, his heart heavy with a sorrow he did not speak aloud. He knew no words could erase such scars, but he also knew the power of presence, of simply staying when all else had abandoned. With each sunrise, she grew stronger. She began to step beyond the threshold of the house, into the fields where the wheat swayed like golden seas beneath the sky. She bent low to touch the soil, to feel its richness between her fingers, and in that simple act she seemed to reclaim something that had long been stolen, the right to labor freely, to plant not under command but under choice. The man watched her from afar, seeing the rhythm of her body as she worked alongside him, her strength returning, her silence slowly giving way to words. Her voice was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though speech itself was foreign. She asked questions of the land, of the seasons, of the tasks she was given. The man answered gruffly, sparing no words, but she listened intently, her hunger for knowledge as fierce as her hunger for bread once had been. The child delighted in this, laughing whenever she stumbled over a phrase, clapping her hands when the woman mastered a new one. Soon, her silence gave way to stories, not of the past, for those wounds she kept locked deep within, but of dreams, of the colors she imagined, of the rivers she longed to see, of the stars she counted in the night sky. The house that had once been somber now breathed with a new rhythm. Songs filled its corners, laughter lit its rooms, and warmth spread where once there had been only duty. The man, though still reserved, began to feel the weight of solitude lift. He would catch himself listening for her voice, watching the way her presence softened the harshness of his world. It unsettled him, for he had not asked for companionship, yet it had taken root like a seed he could not pull from the earth. But the world is rarely content to let peace grow unchallenged. One evening, as dusk bled into night, riders came to the edge of his land. Their torches flickered against the sky, their voices rough with mockery. They demanded to see her, to know why he harbored one who had once worn chains. Their words dripped with venom, calling her tainted, unworthy, a stain upon the village. The man stood firm at his door, his broad frame blocking their path. His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of steel. She is under my roof. She is no longer yours to name, nor yours to chain. Leave this place. The riders laughed, but when they looked into his eyes, they saw a fire that would not yield. They spat upon the earth, muttered curses, and turned their horses away, but their shadows lingered long after their departure. Inside, the woman trembled, her hands clenched, her breath shallow. She feared not only for herself but for the man and child who had bound their lives to hers. But he looked at her, his voice steady, and said, "They will not take you. Not while I stand." Her heart swelled with a fierce gratitude, but also with fear, for she knew the cruelty of men could not be dismissed so easily. Yet she clung to his words, repeating them in her mind as though they were a shield stronger than iron. Winter descended upon the land, wrapping the earth in silence. Snow blanketed the fields, frost clung to the windows, and the days shortened into long nights by the fire. In that season of stillness, their bond deepened. She learned to spin wool beside the hearth, her fingers nimble and steady, weaving threads that would become garments. The child watched in awe, begging to be taught, and soon her small hands clumsily mimicked the woman's graceful motions. The man, though he did not say it, felt pride stir within him as he watched the life within his home knit itself together, stronger with every passing day. Yet still, the past clung to her. At times, when she looked into the flames, her eyes grew distant, and he knew her mind wandered back to places she would not name. Once, in the stillness of night, he asked her softly, "What did they call you, before?" She turned her eyes to him, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a voice that trembled but did not break, she answered, "They called me nothing. Only numbers, commands, silence." His chest tightened, anger burning in his veins, but he spoke with calm resolve, "Then let that name die. You have a new one now, and it will live." She wept then, not with the despair of chains but with the release of them. He did not touch her, for he knew such wounds healed slowly, but his presence was steady, unyielding, a fortress she could lean upon. As spring returned, so too did life flourish upon the land. The fields turned green once more, the river swelled with thawing ice, and the air filled with the sound of birds returning from their long absence. She walked through the fields with the child, their laughter carried by the wind, and for the first time she tilted her face to the sun not as a prisoner but as one who belonged to the earth again. The man watched them from a distance, his heart heavy yet full. He knew the world beyond his land would never cease to whisper, to question, to judge. But within his home, within the circle of his protection, a miracle had taken root. A woman once broken now stood with dignity, clothed not only in a dress but in the strength of her second life. A child who once asked if she was dying now saw her as alive, vibrant, unyielding. And he, who had once lived only to endure, now found himself living for something greater. The story of her chains no longer defined her. What defined her now was the laughter that filled the air, the bread that rose in the oven, the songs that soothed the night, and the names spoken with love rather than cruelty. She had come in chains, yes, but she lived now in freedom, clothed not in iron but in grace, not in silence but in song. And though shadows still lurked beyond their walls, within them, light burned strong, fierce enough to defy the darkness. The thaw of spring carried with it more than blossoms and soft winds. It carried whispers of unrest that drifted even into the quiet corners of his land. Though the earth broke free from its frozen sleep and the rivers rushed with new life, the hearts of men beyond his fields still lay heavy with suspicion. They had not forgotten the woman, nor forgiven him for giving her a name when the world had stripped her of one. The woman rose each morning with the sun, her hands busy with the work of the household, her voice soft as she guided the child through tasks once too great for her small arms. She baked bread whose fragrance filled the house, mended garments with needle and thread, and swept the floors until the wood shone beneath the firelight. Yet even in her busyness, shadows of her past clung to her like unseen chains. Sometimes her eyes lingered too long on the iron kettle, or her breath caught when the creak of the floorboards echoed like a lash. But she forced herself forward, step by step, until each day became proof that she was no longer what they had made her. The child adored her with a devotion that had no hesitation. She trailed her through the fields, her small fingers gripping the woman's hand as though afraid she might vanish if released. She asked her to sing again and again, songs that seemed to rise from some deep well within her. The words were not always in a tongue the child understood, but the melody carried a weight that soothed her heart and filled the house with warmth. "Sing the one about the river," the child would whisper, and the woman would hum low, her voice wrapping around them both like a blanket against the cold. The man kept his silence, yet his watchful eyes betrayed his thoughts. He saw how the woman's presence steadied the child, how her laughter softened the hard edges of the house, and though he said little, he found himself listening for the sound of her steps as though the silence of their absence would be unbearable. He had long lived with the stillness of solitude, but now it seemed unbearable compared to the life she brought. Yet life in that century was not kind to defiance. The men of the village, sharp-eyed and cruel of tongue, gathered in the tavern to whisper. They remembered the day she was brought in chains, the way she stumbled upon the dirt, the sound of iron striking earth. To them, chains defined her. To them, she would always be less than human. And so their envy festered, their hatred swelling with each passing season as they saw her walk in freedom upon land they claimed as their own. One afternoon, when the sun burned hot against the fields, a boy from the village lingered at the edge of the man's property. His eyes gleamed with mischief as he shouted words meant to wound. He called her by names not hers, names born of cruelty, spitting them into the wind. The woman froze, her heart racing, but the child, small though she was, stepped forward and shouted back with the boldness only innocence could hold. "That is not her name. She is ours. She is alive." The boy laughed, running back to his kin, but the woman fell to her knees, tears spilling, not from weakness but from the strength of the child's defense. The man came then, his voice sharp but steady. "Do not listen to them," he told her. "The world does not grant names, nor does it strip them. What is spoken in this house is truth, and truth will outlast lies." She lifted her eyes to him, searching for the firmness in his words, and for the first time she believed that perhaps her new life was not as fragile as she feared. They dreamed of chains breaking, of iron shattering beneath her feet, and when she awoke, her breath was steady, her eyes clear. She began to stand taller in the days that followed, her back no longer bent by memory. When she walked through the fields, the villagers saw her no longer as a shadow, but as a figure clothed in dignity. Some turned their heads, others muttered curses, but none could deny that she carried herself as though reborn. Still, the riders returned. It was in the height of summer, the air thick and heavy, when hooves thundered once more upon the edge of the land. Their voices carried across the fields, demanding she be given over, insisting no woman of chains could walk free without consequence. The man strode out to meet them, his steps deliberate, his eyes fierce beneath the brim of his hat. He carried no weapon in hand, but the weight of his stance was weapon enough. "You have no claim here," he said, his voice carrying across the field like a blade. "This land is mine, this house is mine, and those within it are mine to protect." One of the riders spat into the dirt, his sneer twisted. "You defy the order of things. Chains are chains." She was marked, and marks do not fade. The man did not flinch. Marks fade when mercy speaks louder than cruelty. "Leave, or you will taste the soil with your teeth." The riders laughed, but the sound rang hollow against his certainty. They muttered their threats and rode away, dust rising in their wake. Yet the woman trembled long after they had gone, fear crawling beneath her skin. But when the man turned to her, his eyes steady, she felt her heart steady with his. He had not bent, and in his defiance she found strength. The child sensed the heaviness of those days, yet she refused to yield to fear. She clung even tighter to the woman, pulling her into games, into laughter, into songs. "If you are afraid, Sing louder, she told her, her small hands gripping hers. And so the woman sang, her voice lifting into the night, not to banish fear entirely, but to remind herself she was more than it. As autumn painted the leaves with fire, the woman began to weave more than garments. She wove stories into the fabric of their nights, stories of rivers and forests, of mountains and stars. The child listened wide-eyed, clinging to every word, while the man sat silently by the fire, his gaze fixed upon the flames but his ears catching every note of her voice. In her stories, the woman found a way to speak her heart without laying bare the wounds she still carried. And in those stories, both the man and the child found themselves drawn closer to her spirit. One evening, as the wind howled against the shutters, the child asked a question that hung heavy in the air. Will they come back for her, Daddy? Her voice quivered, small but determined. The man set aside his pipe, his eyes meeting his daughter's. They may try, but she is not theirs to take. Not now, not ever. The woman looked at him then, her heart swelling with a gratitude so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She whispered softly, almost to herself, I thought I was nothing. But here, I am something. He did not answer, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with the weight of truth, with the unspoken vow that her second life was as real as the soil beneath their feet. The winter that followed was harsh, fiercer than any in memory. Snow piled high against the walls, winds cut through the land like blades, and hunger gnawed at their stores. Yet within the house, warmth endured. The woman's hands worked tirelessly, spinning wool, baking bread, tending the fire. The child clung close, her laughter a defiance against the cold. And the man labored day and night, breaking ice from the well, hunting what little game remained, always returning with weary steps but unbroken resolve. In those long nights, the woman found herself no longer haunted by chains but strengthened by the bond of the family she had found. She no longer woke with screams tearing her throat. Instead, she woke to the soft breathing of the child nestled against her, to the steady presence of the man guarding them both. The shadows of her past did not vanish, but they no longer ruled her. When the first thaw came, when the rivers roared once more and the fields stretched green beneath the sky, she stepped outside and breathed deeply of the air. She lifted her face to the sun, her arms outstretched, her heart swelling with a freedom that was no longer borrowed but her own. The villagers might whisper, the riders might return, but none could strip from her the life she now carried within. She had come in chains, but chains no longer defined her. She had been nameless, but now she bore a name spoken with love. She had once been close to death, and now she lived, not merely survived, but lived with laughter, with dignity, with hope. And as she stood upon the land that had become her own, she knew that no iron forged by men could ever take that from her again. The thaw of that winter had barely softened the ground when new trouble pressed its shadow over the valley. The snow melted into rivulets that wound their way down into the riverbeds, the earth drank deeply, and the first buds showed against the brown branches, yet the air was tense with the weight of words carried from the village. A gathering had been called, a meeting where men whispered about order, about purity, about what belonged and what did not. Her name, her new name, the one spoken only in that house, was never mentioned, for to them she had no name. She was spoken of as a blight, a reminder of chains they wanted never to see broken. The man knew of it before the news reached his ears, for he could feel it in the way the merchants stiffened when he passed in the market, in the way silence lingered longer than greetings, in the way doors closed quicker than before. He carried no fear on his face, but inside he weighed every mood. He had long been alone, yet now he bore two souls under his care, two lives bound to his heart, and he knew the cost of defiance might one day be blood. Still, he did not falter, for the woman who once crawled in chains now walked with dignity, and to yield her to cruelty again was something he would never do. She sensed the shift before he spoke of it. She saw it in his eyes when he returned from the market, in the firmness of his step, in the silence that clung to him more than before. She asked once, softly, "Are they coming for me?" He looked at her then, not as a man unsure, but as one rooted deep. "They may come, but they will not take you. Not while I draw breath." His words gave her strength, yet also fear, for she knew men could kill as easily as they could scorn, and no vow of protection could change the nature of their cruelty. Still, she chose to trust him, for in that trust lay the only life she had known that was worth holding. The child, innocent but not blind, felt the tension in the air. Her laughter, once free as birdsong, carried a sharper edge, as though she knew joy must be louder to silence the world's threats. She clung even tighter to the woman, refusing to leave her side, her voice rising in defense whenever whispers drifted close. "She is mine," she told strangers with a boldness too great for her small frame. "She is my mother now." Those words pierced deeper than any insult could, for they gave the woman something chains had stolen: belonging. The summer brought no reprieve. The fields flourished under the man's care, golden wheat bowing in the breeze, yet with every cart of grain he brought to the village, the hostility grew sharper. Some men spat as he passed, others muttered about judgment, but he bore it in silence, his shoulders square, his gaze fixed forward. The woman waited each time with a pounding heart until he returned, her fear mingling with the relief of his presence. One day, he returned not only with grain but with bruises upon his knuckles. She saw them before he could hide them, her breath catching as she reached for his hand. "What did they do?" she whispered. He shook his head, his jaw set. "It is nothing." But she knew the hardness of his silence, knew it was not nothing, knew men had tested him and he had not bent. She pressed a cloth to his hand, her fingers trembling against his skin. He did not pull away, and for a moment their eyes met, hers full of unspoken gratitude, his heavy with the weight of burdens he would never place upon her. In that silence, something passed between them, not of words but of truth. They were bound together now, not by chains but by choice, by the fragile but unbreakable thread of shared defiance. As the harvest came, the villagers grew bolder. One evening, as the sky burned red with the sinking sun, stones were thrown against the house. The child screamed, clutching to the woman, while the man strode out into the dusk, his voice thundering across the fields. Enough! His shout carried with it the authority of years, the weight of a man unafraid of battle. The stones ceased, and in the gathering gloom shadows fled, but he knew it was not the end. It was only the beginning. The woman wept softly that night, her hands pressed to the child's hair as she sang her into sleep. When the child's breathing slowed, she looked at him, her eyes shimmering with fear. "I am the cause of this. If I were not here," but he cut her words short, his tone iron. "If you were not here, this house would be empty stone. You were not the cause. You were the reason it lives." Those words rooted themselves deep in her, deeper than any comfort she had ever known. For so long she had been told she was nothing, a burden, a shadow. But here, in this house, she was life itself, the heart that beat within its walls. Autumn passed, winter came, and with it trials greater still. The village declared openly that she should be driven out. A council of men gathered, their voices thick with hatred, their decision carried to him by trembling hands. "She cannot stay," they said. "If you keep her, you defy us all." He listened to their message in silence, then crumpled the paper in his fist and cast it into the fire. The woman watched, fear and awe mingling in her chest. He turned to her then, his voice steady. "Their words do not govern this house. You remain." Yet he knew it would not end with words. The night that followed was restless, the winds battering the shutters, the air heavy with foreboding. He sat by the fire long after the others had gone to sleep, his hand resting upon the old rifle that hung above the hearth. He had not used it in years, but its weight was familiar, its purpose clear. If they came, he would not yield. And they did come. It was in the dead of night, when the moon hung low and the stars shivered behind clouds. The pounding on the door shook the house, shouts rising like a storm. The woman woke with a gasp, clutching the child close. The man rose, rifle in hand, and strode to the door. His voice cut through the chaos. "Leave now, or face what you bring." But they did not leave. The door splintered under their weight, torches spilling light into the darkness. He fired once, the sound cracking through the night, and a man fell. The others faltered, their courage shaken, but anger drove them forward. The woman, clutching the child, felt terror grip her heart, yet within it burned something else, resolve. She had lived through chains, through cruelty, through silence, but she would not lose this second life without standing. She pulled the child behind her and seized the iron poker from the hearth, her hand steady though her body trembled. The fight was brief but fierce. The man stood like a wall, his rifle a thunder in the night, his fists like stone. The woman swung the poker with a cry, striking away the hand of one who reached too close. Together, they held the threshold, together they drove back the storm. When it ended, silence fell heavy. The attackers fled, their torches scattered in the dirt, their courage broken. The man stood breathing hard, blood upon his brow, while the woman clutched the child close, her body trembling not with fear but with the surge of survival. In the aftermath, the house bore scars, splintered wood, shattered glass, but it still stood. And so did they. The child, wide-eyed, whispered, "They could not take you." The woman, tears streaming, pressed her forehead to the child's and whispered, "No, they could not." From that night forward, something changed. The village no longer approached with stones or fire, for they had seen the cost of their hatred. Whispers still lingered, scorn still burned, but they dared not strike again. And within the house, a new strength took root. The woman, once bound, now stood unbroken. The man, once alone, now bore a family worth any battle. The child, once fearful, now carried the memory of defiance that would shape her heart forever. They had faced chains, whispers, stones, and fire, and still they stood. The world beyond might never accept her, might never grant her peace, but within those walls she had found life, a life forged not in iron but in love, not in silence but in song, not in fear but in the unyielding truth of freedom. And though the world might call her nameless, within that home she bore a name spoken with reverence, carried with dignity, and held with love strong enough to outlast the cruelty of centuries. The years that followed tested them in ways neither the man, the woman, nor the child could have foreseen. The attack on their home had not silenced the whispers in the village, though it had subdued their violence. Fear had replaced open aggression, but fear has its own venom, and rumors spread like wildfire among the people. Some called the woman a witch, others claimed she had cursed the land. Yet still she walked the fields in freedom, still she sang songs at night, still she bore herself with dignity that no chain could touch. The man stood resolute at her side, his strength a constant shield. He was not a man of many words, but the world began to notice that his silence carried more weight than most men's speeches. He no longer bothered to defend himself in taverns or markets, he did not need to. His defiance had been written in the blood spilled that night, in the shattered door and broken torches. He had declared, without asking permission, that she was his to protect, and he had proven it with iron and fire. The child grew taller with each passing season, her steps quicker, her laughter louder, her eyes sharper. She clung to the woman not with the desperation of fear but with the trust of love. The bond between them deepened into something unbreakable, something that carried the force of truth. To the child, there was no memory of the woman in chains, only of her singing, working, laughing, and loving. She would not speak of the day she asked her father if the woman was dying, for to her, that question no longer made sense. The woman was not dying. She was alive in every sense, alive enough to light a fire in anyone who dared stand close to her. But beyond the walls of their house, the world shifted. The century itself was restless. Men in distant places began to speak of liberty, of freedom, of rights that could not be bought or sold. Rumors of revolution reached even the quiet fields where they lived. Some scoffed at such ideas, others whispered of them in fear, but for the woman, these words stirred something long buried. She had lived as one stripped of freedom, then risen into it again, and she knew in her soul that freedom was no gift of kings or councils, it was the birthright of every beating heart. One day, as the sun stretched high over the fields, she spoke to the man with a trembling resolve. "Others are still in chains," she said, her eyes fierce. "Others suffer as I did. We cannot hide here forever. If my second life has meaning, it must be to bring freedom to more than myself." The man listened in silence, his jaw tight, his heart heavy. He wanted to keep her safe, to keep their home untouched by the world's violence, but he could not deny the truth in her words. He had seen her rise from the ashes, had seen her transform from shadow into flame. To cage her now, even in safety, would be another kind of chain. "You will not go alone," he said at last, his voice steady. "If you carry this burden, we carry it with you." The child clapped her hands with delight, though she did not fully understand. All she knew was that her mother, her true mother, was speaking of a mission larger than their home, and she was proud. And so it began, quietly at first, with whispers carried to those who still bore scars like hers, with hidden meetings in barns, with secret gatherings under the cover of night. She told her story not as a tale of despair but as a hymn of survival, a testimony that chains could break, that names could be restored, that life could bloom again where the world had sown only death. Men and women listened, their eyes widening, their hearts stirring. Some wept openly, others clenched their fists, but all felt the fire she carried. She had not been taught to lead, had never sought it, but her voice became a banner none could ignore. She did not speak in lofty language or fine rhetoric, but in the raw truth of her life, and truth carried more power than any crafted speech. The man stood at her side in every gathering, his presence a fortress, his silence a declaration that her words were worth defending. The child, now older, watched with eyes wide and heart swelling, her soul shaped by the courage she witnessed. The village could not ignore it forever. What had begun as scorn shifted into wary respect. The same men who had thrown stones now lowered their eyes when she passed, for they could not reconcile their hatred with the power of her dignity. And some, those who had once mocked the loudest, began to listen. They saw that she had not only survived but had become stronger than they had ever been. Her life shamed them, not by accusation, but by its undeniable truth. Seasons turned into years, and her story spread beyond their valley. Travelers carried whispers of the woman who had come in chains but now spoke of freedom. Her name, her true name, given in love, was carried on the wind, repeated in places she had never seen, until it became more than a name. It became a symbol, yet even as her influence grew, she never abandoned the small circle of her family. She still tended the hearth, still sang the child to sleep, still walked the fields with the man at her side. Her greatness was not in abandoning the life they had built, but in carrying it with her wherever she went, showing the world that freedom began in the simplest acts of love and defiance. Years later, when the child had grown into a young woman herself, strong and unafraid, she asked her father the question once more. "Daddy, is she alive now?" But this time her voice was not trembling, not afraid. It was curious, almost reverent, as though she knew the answer already. The man, older now, his hair streaked with gray, looked at the woman who had once crawled in chains and now stood like a pillar of fire. He looked at the laughter in her eyes, the strength in her back, the love in her every act, and he said with a voice that carried the weight of every battle they had fought, "She is more than alive. She is life itself." The woman, hearing him, felt tears gather, not of sorrow but of fulfillment. She had been broken, nameless, nearly dead, but now she had become a wellspring of hope not only for herself but for all who heard her story. Chains had tried to claim her, but chains had failed. Death had whispered at her, but life had shouted louder. And in that truth lay the conclusion not only of her story but of theirs. A life rebuilt, a family forged, a name restored, and a legacy that could not be silenced. For in the end, she had come in chains, but she left this world in freedom, clothed in dignity, her name carried on the lips of generations. And though time would fade the house, the fields, even the village itself, her story would remain. Proof that mercy can break iron, that love can outlast hatred, and that even in the harshest of centuries, a second life can bloom from the ashes of despair. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.